All right, if everybody please take your seats. We're going to start this in about 1 minute. All right, thank you for coming. I'm going to call this meeting to order of the Energy, Utilities, and Telecommunications Committee of the Georgia House of Representatives. We're here for the purpose of taking up Senate Bill 31. Before we get started, I'd like to ask everybody to please check your cell phone, make sure that the sound is turned off. Either turn them off or turn the sound off, one or the other.
There's nobody claiming responsibility for it.
All right, we've called a meeting to order. Before we get started, if you've checked your cell phones and turned off the sound, Chair would like to call on Representative Clay Cox. He's going to, we've had one of our former House members and one of our senators has had a tragic loss over the weekend, Representative Cox. Make sure I have you on here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's offer a prayer. Father God, we come to you this morning just knowing that you're in control. And, Lord, it's times like these we don't really understand all the whys, Father, but we know that you're there to comfort Renee Unterman and her family at the time of their great loss. And we just ask that you do so and show us the way, God, if there's anything we can do to help you in that cause, Lord. We ask it in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Thank you, Representative Cox. I made a mistake when I first came in here. I allowed some things to be handed out. I think I can, and nothing against the person who handed out or anything, but just to identify. Normally I would want anything's handed out to the members be identified who put them out. Representative Wicks, these are things that you had handed out. Is that correct? Okay, I just want to make sure that. Okay, and that's fine. You'd asked me, and I was preoccupied. But anyway, what you have on your desk has been handed out to this point. Representative Wicks handed that out. We have under consideration Senate Bill 31. Chairman Bob Smith, are you here? Do you have a subcommittee report?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The subcommittee of Regulatory and Utilities Affairs met last Wednesday for 2.5 hours or so, and then again on Friday this past week for an hour and a half or so to discuss Senate Bill 31. The subcommittee voted to pass and bring forward to this committee, do pass, Senate Bill 31, SB 31/CSFA/2, Mr. Chairman. Do pass.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Senate Bill 31. Now it's my understanding that Representative Ben Harbin, Chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, is going to present this bill. Make sure I get you on here. Which one would that be? Okay, Representative Harbin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, let me thank Chairman Smith, the chairman of your subcommittee, for his patience over those last 2 days of hearings that he had. There was a lot of discussion, lively discussion, which I think brought a good bit of clarity, I hope, to this issue and where we are, and that is why I think the subcommittee was able to pass it, or the do pass recommendation. What Senate Bill 31 does, and I want to be clear in this. The title of this is the Georgia Nuclear Energy Financing Act. There's been a lot of discussion about nuclear power and whether this is the right direction to go in. I believe it is. But those decisions on whether to build this plant have been made at the federal level, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, by all of the so-called experts that we've heard about over the last 4 hours of debate, over the last 4 hours we had last week of debate. And that decision will be made whether it should be built in this state, the Public Service Commission. What we're trying to determine here is should the ratepayers of Georgia Power, who handle about 50% of the rate-paying customers in this state, should those ratepayers have an opportunity for savings on how we build this plant or when we build this plant. And this establishes the construction while in progress, which is done by several other states that surround us. Florida, as I understand, has dropped in a measure that will have a similar effect to what we're trying to do. They already have it, but they are moving more closely to what we're doing with this piece of legislation. And all this says that in 2011, when construction begins, that the ratepayers of Georgia Power will get an incremental increase, a slight, smaller increase than they would in 2016 or 2000. Am I right? 16, 17. If we do this with incremental increase, it works out to about a 9% increase. If we do this, if we wait and do it the way we've done it in the past, the way they did it up until the late 70s when we used to have this in effect and it was changed, then it will hammer them pretty hard with a over 12% increase. In 2016 and 17, it will be immediate, it will be dramatic, and it will be a shock in many places where they cannot afford it. So this incrementally increases it slowly. But the bottom line is it saves those rate-paying customers $300 million on construction costs. That's a lot of money on the financing costs, of those construction dollars. So that's the bottom line of what we're trying to do here today. The Senate added some consumer protection amendments by taking into account the Public Service Commission had by regulation 150% of poverty to allow them some savings on their rate paying. The Senate took that to 200% and put it into law, which makes it more difficult to change. They put some other things in to true up each year so that if there are savings on interest costs, instead of Georgia Power receiving those savings, they will be affected back into the rate so that, again, protects the ratepayer. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a good bill. Some folks are going to say that we shouldn't be dealing with this, that the Public Service Commission should be dealing with this. They're still involved in this process. They will determine whether that plant should be there. But the Public Service Commission, created by this body in the General Assembly, can only pass regulation. Regulation can change at any time. Building this nuclear power plant will take time. And in order to have a good business model, to lay something out there needs to be some protection of this being in the law. And that's what we're asking you to do today, is pass a law that protects the rate-paying customers of Georgia by allowing them to have lower cost energy in the long run. One other point I want to make, there's been some people say that we shouldn't do this now because people are going to be paying for this that will never receive benefit of those power plants. This is a great country, and what's made us a great country is we aren't that selfish in our thoughts. When Eisenhower created the interstate system, he didn't say, I'm only going to allow those people who are going to use the interstate to pay for it. We began building that, and nobody questioned it because we knew that ultimately it benefited everybody in this country. The same effect is in this issue. This power plant will benefit everybody in this state. And so it must be done today, and everybody should have a hand in helping us to build this so that our children and our grandchildren will have the energy available to do the things that we enjoy, and it will be done at a lower cost than it could be if we waited till a few years from now. Mr. Chairman, that is quite simply all this bill does. Now we yield for questions.
Thank you, Representative Harbin. You do have a question. Would you take it?
Yes.
Take a question?
Yes, sir.
Chair recognizes Representative Chuck Martin.
Mr. Chairman, if you could, I think part of the confusion, I've gotten emails that have questioned that this been to be paying the power company back for the construction costs, and I believe those come on page 2 of the bill, lines 53 through 57. And I believe this was added by the Senate to be that true-up that you mentioned earlier, and it talks about to reflect the level of construction costs. Is it not true that one has to recalculate those construction costs to get to the finance costs? But can you articulate from the committee, when that construction cost is mentioned in the bill, that does not contemplate the company receiving any funds for construction costs in this measure. Isn't that true?
That's the way I understand it. Yes, sir, Mr. Barton. This is about the financing, the money they'll have to finance to build this plant, and this is about allowing them to true it up to make sure the ratepayers will receive the savings for the actual cost of the financing as we're going through this process over the next 7 to 8 years.
I just to follow up, I think that is where there's been some confusion with some consumers that I'd spoken to over the weekend, because the emails have come in that we shouldn't be paying for the construction costs because on line 54 those are mentioned. But those are necessary to true up the actual cost of financing so the ratepayers do not overpay.
Absolutely. The PSC will be a part of that true-up process. Sometimes there's confusion. There's unintentional confusion and intentional confusion. I'm not going to say which one I think this is, but this is a very good bill that just protects the consumers by saving them $300 million.
Thank you, Representative Martin. Did that answer your question?
Yes, sir.
We have a question from Representative David Lucas, former chairman of the committee. Representative Lucas, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir, Mr. Lucas.
It was proposed and written that it would cost the average customer $1.30 a year extra on their bill. Now, does that $1.30 increase the following year? Is it $1.30 throughout, or it goes up to $2.60?
It's a $1.30 increase, incremental increase.
Excuse me 1 minute. Let me cut this off.
I can wait if it's important.
I don't think the constituents think this is more important than this right here.
And I think your constituents will too when they see.
Is it $1.30 throughout until it comes on, or is it $1.30 every year?
It's $1.30 every year from 2011 to 2017. But now, if you don't.
That got it then.
That will work out to about a 9% overall increase, whereas if we wait till 2016 to do this, 2017, it will be an over 12% increase. So the reason you're having this incremental increase is to make it easier to handle each year, but also to keep the costs lower in the long run so that we see a substantial savings on the construction of this plant.
Other questions is, Georgia Power is a stock company. Why is it the stockholders don't pay the entire cost?
The stockholders take a significant risk in this. If this plant were to not make profit or any of that, the stockholders do have a significant risk, and they have invested quite a bit of money into expanding these plants. But Georgia Power is also a regulated company, and when they go out and ask for rate increases and things like that, Public Service Commission has to go through and approve all of those things. So what you're trying to do is establish a incremental increase through the rate process, through the financing process, or incremental increase in the rate process for covering the financing of this cost. So everybody will be participating, even the stockholders are involved in this. But we don't regulate those stockholders, so that is not something we put into here.
Well, is it not true that you have the EMC's part of this power plant?
And that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. The EMCs, the MEAGs, the city of Dalton, I believe, is the other partner. We'll have about 55%, as I understand it, ownership of these two units, 3 and 4. And the MEAGs and the EMCs can utilize the provisions that we're putting into this bill today if they wish to, and they've done that in the past. So all we're doing really is trying to establish some equal footing for Georgia Power and their partners in construction of this plant.
Well, isn't it true that your MEAGs, your non-profits, they have a board of directors, and if they're not pleased with their rates, they can always elect a new board of directors?
Georgia Power has a board of directors, and they have to go through the same process.
Yeah, but it's kind of hard to get to them. I mean, when you're talking about a stock company,
we can't get to the MEAGs or EMCs either. I mean, in the measure that you're talking about. So, I mean, these are similar companies. Georgia Power just happens to be the largest energy supplier in our state. And I think that with that, and they've been a good partner for our state, then they should have the same opportunity for financing that the MEAGs and the EMCs have.
Last question.
Yes.
Why is it that we're doing this in the legislature when the PSC can do it right now?
I brought that up a few minutes ago. The PSC, this was a measure of the PSC years ago, and they pulled it back. They passed regulations. Georgia Power, as you pointed out, is a stockholding company, has stockholders. They're a private company. It's heavily regulated. And in order to establish a good business model, we've seen what happens when people don't have a good business model that they can depend on. We're dealing with the automakers today because they don't have a good business model. We're having to bail them out. But in order to establish a good business model, you need to know that the protections are there. When you say, I'm going to borrow this money and this is the way the rates will work, then you've got to know that that's the way it's going to work. And putting this in statute allows some protection for Georgia Power and financing, but for the consumers also, so that we know those incremental costs will happen instead of through regulation it being changed at the drop of a hat or just through a PSC regulation being changed back, and rates have to go up substantially to cover those costs.
Who in the legislature? We catch enough hell just trying to get secretary. Now, who do we have that we got on staff that can tell us about utility rates, what takes it to make a kilowatt or a megawatt? I mean, how many legislators in here know anything about it? I thought the PSC has a staff to go through all that and determine whether or not they will allow this to be in their rate of return. I call it they get a profit, but they use the rate of return. I looked 76. They had a rate of return of 12.52, and 08, 07 they had a rate return of 11.25. To me, that says that we guarantee a profit to a utility, when others say it's not a profit, it's a rate of return. Well, they're still making money. And so my question is, can't the PSC do exactly what we are talking about doing right now, outside of them being able to build a plant and charge the rate customers the finance charges on it?
Excuse me, Representative Lucas, I appreciate the question. I know that the Chairman Harbin does too. I would ask you make that your last question until we've had a chance to go around. There are a lot of other people.
Well, that's my last question.
As I've said, the PSC could do this, but it's only regulation. This gives the protection so that the ratepayers of Georgia Power, they know there's some stability in that pricing, and it ultimately saves them $300 million. This is a very simple proposition, Mr. Lucas. I do not understand the confusion behind it. Georgia Power, yes, they're a private company. Yes, they have stockholders. Those stockholders have money at risk in this issue. But the ratepayers who receive that energy, the energy demands that we have in this state, which are growing even in a down economy, they receive some stability in knowing what that incremental price increase will be. But ultimately, it saves them money instead of being hammered when the plant was completed in 2016. This is a better way to finance it. It's the way we all finance when we go out and purchase something. It's the way we try to do it. We look for the lowest cost, and that's all we're doing here is putting this in the statute so that the business practices of this company that is regulated, they can know that they will have an incremental increase every year, and this won't be changed willy-nilly unless it goes through this lengthy process like it has here.
Thank you. Representative Bob Smith has a question. Make sure I have you turned on here, Representative Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Harbin, there's a couple of questions that I've asked, and maybe you can't address this, but I'm going to ask them to you. There's been comments made that since Georgia Power is a stock company, let the stockholders take the risk instead of the ratepayers. And having said that, my understanding of the stockholders is that the Public Service Commission regulates and also determines what type of profit that they can make. And if you could correct me on that, are they restrained as to how far they can make a profit before they have to return some of those profits back to the ratepayers in the form of a rate reduction?
Yes, sir. They're a regulated company, and those profits are they are regulated. And if there is too excessive a profit, then that is put back into a lower rate cost. And Georgia Power does a good job. We're one of the, I don't remember what number, we're in the bottom 10 in rates, I think, or at some point we were. We're 15% below the national average in rates, and I think that is because PSC has done a pretty good job of regulating that and making sure that those profits get back into the ratepayers. And what we're trying to do here is establish this rule that very simply just has some stability in the financing for Georgia Power in the future, and their rates and their profits will still be regulated.
So could I follow up with that, sir? Is it not true that Georgia Power loses money on this and then the stockholders at risk? Or is that back to the PSC to ask for recovery? That's
a combination of both, isn't it? I believe that The stockholders are always at risk if the company were to lose money, but the PSC would probably get involved to try to shore it up to make sure that the company survives, just because so many people depend on it if they were to lose some money. But again, that's the stockholders are ultimately going to be the ones that are hit the hardest in profits and losses.
Further question, Mr. Chairman. There's other comments made that since Florida, Alabama, North Carolina, and others will benefit from this, then why don't we have them to pay for the nuclear power plant?
Well, they won't benefit. All the power produced by these two plants will be used by Georgia customers. That's again, I think, just some confusion that's been thrown out there. These two power plants are being built to meet the needs of a growing Georgia. So I can't speak to why anyone else would think that those states, outside of the fact that those states allow this type construction to go on, or this type financing to go on while in construction, they really have nothing to do with this, except for they've done this in the past and they've had success with it when they've built these plants, and we ought to follow their lead in doing this. They have it in the statute, but they will not receive any of the power from these plants. Georgia Power's, all of the power produced by Georgia Power at 3 and 4 units, 3 and 4 at Plant Vogtle, will be for Georgia customers.
One follow-up question. If we do nothing, Mr. Chairman, if we do nothing in regards to this legislation, what happens?
Plant Vogtle will still be built. The units 3 and 4 will still come online, but the ratepayers of this state will be hit with a much higher cost to purchase their energy. It will cost them a lot more money in the beginning, and ultimately it will cost them a lot more money if we don't do anything.
Thank you, Representative Smith. Representative Drenner, I'll make sure I have your mic turned on. Representative Drenner.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman.
2 questions, if you don't mind. First of all, it's my understanding that large ratepayers are exempt under this bill.
No, that's not true.
Then that answers both questions, then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Drenner. Representative Glenn Baker, let me turn your mic on. Just one, say you're number 11. Representative Baker.
Mr. Chairman, it seems like the residential customers are the ones that have a good many questions. Could you tell us what the increase of the $1.30, how many kW hours that is going to be? Isn't that pretty high? They base it on something like that?
That's based on an average of 1,000 kilowatt hours.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Chair recognizes Representative Wicks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Chairman Harbin, I've got some comments that I handed out. I want to first say this, to me, has nothing to do with the importance of Georgia Power Company to the state of Georgia and what it has done and what it will do. I'm a former employee of Georgia Power Company many, many years ago, a great company. But I'm reflecting some comments from my constituents and other interested parties in this bill, and no doubt that it has been discussed, and I sat in on the subcommittee meeting last week just to hear the discussion at that time. And one thing that really sort of heightened my concern was this morning on the way to the Capitol, I received a call from many of us, and most of us will remember the Colonial Pipeline issue that came up a couple of years ago, and my district was the only one to be impacted by the new third pipeline and had a lot of people upset. This was a $3 billion project from the Gulf of Mexico to Powder Springs, which is the only city in my district. I bring that up because I got a call on the way down from the vice president here in Atlanta to say that they had scrapped that project and they're not building the $3 billion Colonial Pipeline due to economic conditions and so forth, so on. So as I say, that had heightened my awareness. And I have laid on the desks, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to do that, and I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to copy my card on this so everybody would know who handed it out. But it was brought to my attention, and this is a question that I'd like for somebody to answer, and hopefully I could maybe, I don't think we're taking other testimony, but maybe if I could even ask a representative of the Public Service Commission to answer this for me. We are seeing, and I've tried to read through the bill, and I'm seeing costs of financing and the applicable certified cost, the actual cost of debt, authorized cost of equity capital and capital structure, and I know I'm rambling on, but I do have a question, Mr. Chairman. Of the early collection of the financing costs, as I understand, it's a blend of equity and debt. And when we look at this from the amount, the handout that I handed everyone, that this should be interest on debt only. But when we look at this total amount of money that's going to be collected from 2011 to 17, is that some $2 billion, I believe. Is that not include $1 billion in early profit for Georgia Power and $500 million plus to interest on the construction debt? Could you answer that? Is there a...
I'm going to let Senator Balfour, the author.
Okay.
Representative Wicks, let me say, too, I do not plan to call on the PSC or anyone else. However, the presenter of the bill, if he wants to call on somebody in order to provide clarification in presenting the bill, I'm going to leave that up to him at his request. Thank you.
Since I just saw the amendment, I was going to ask Senator Balfour if he could follow up.
Thank you, Representative. Let me mention to you the way the Public Service Commission works, and in the way this bill works, the Public Service Commission still decides how much of a construction project is debt and how much of it is stock. So the financial cost includes, and normally they do about a 50-50, maybe 52-48, but it's basically 50-50. So the Public Service Commission will decide what the blend is. Let's assume it's 50-50, which is where it normally is. 52-48 doesn't change it much. If it's a $4.4 billion project, then it's going to be $2.2 billion in stock and $2.2 billion in equity. Now, the financial cost would be $2.2 billion in stock at whatever interest rate they get, and $2.2 billion in stockholders' amounts that they're putting in based on what the Public Service Commission decides their rate of return is. And that's the way that's whether this plant gets built with this bill or without this bill. The confusion in this is that somehow what we're doing is somewhat different. The only thing this bill does is it says the financial costs, and sometimes I make a mistake and I say the interest costs. It's the entire financial cost gets paid as we go along. The fact that there's $1 billion in early profit, I'm an accountant. Somebody's going to have to show me that. That's not there. The cost of this project is $4.4 billion on the Georgia Power side. If you take this 5 to 6% debt and you take 11.25% equity and you assume 50%, so the average cost is going to be about 8%. Take $4.4 billion, assume it's spread evenly over 5 years, which it wouldn't necessarily be. Take 8% interest. It doesn't take long with the calculator to figure out that's about $2 billion in interest. Financial costs.
Representative Wicks, that answer your question?
So, is there early profit in the money that they're going to start collecting beginning in 2011 through 2017? I was under the impression it was going to be start collecting the interest on the construction loan early to save over that period of time, but I'm just, and I'm not an accountant either, and I'll be the first to admit that, but that's my question, is when they start collecting in 2011, there is a profit factor in that built in, or will they be making money on the money that they're collecting to finance this debt? That's what I'm wondering.
Okay. If you mean by profit the 11.25% equity?
Equity, yes.
Then yes, the cost of building the power plant, if you, with this bill, you're going to collect the 11.25% of the equity, because the plant's being built by two pots of money. Remember that. 2.2, assuming 50-50, 2.2 billion in a bond, a note, and 2.2 billion in stock that they have to raise from somewhere. So you're raising stock. The stockholders expect a rate of return. Who decides that rate of return? The Public Service Commission, just like they do now. And then the rate of return here on this 2.2 billion, the interest rate here, that's your financial cost. Other than the financial cost, there's no other income. Now, to be honest with you, in this bill, we have put in the Senate version an amendment that says they cannot make a dime over that. We true up every year. Let's assume in your statement here you say it could be between 5 and 6% debt, and it could be. Let's assume they project 6% debt, and at the end of the year we find out it was only 5% debt. With this bill, they'd have to return the extra 1% back to the shareholders, not the shareholders, to the customers. Under current law, they don't have to do that. Under current law, if they estimate 6 and they end up being 5, they make a little extra money. With this, they do not make any extra money. This will be the entire financial cost of building this plant, minus you're saving them $300 million to all the ratepayers in the state by not having interest on top of interest.
Representative Wicks, did I answer your question?
One more follow-up.
Okay, one more question.
Okay. So you're saying there, I thought that I understood this to be collecting interest on starting in 2011, and that was going to save the ratepayers $300 million.
That's correct.
If this bill passes, they'll begin collecting this money in 11. So there is an element of profit in that. So Georgia Power is making a profit or equity, return on equity on the money they're collecting in 2011. So it's not only just financing costs or financing debt. It's we're going over words. If you build something and it costs $4 billion, $4 million, $4 whatever, and you put $2 million in interest and $2 million in stock, what is the financial cost of building that plant? It's it took $4 to build the thing. Well, you get interest over here, and you get stockholder return over here, which is the way it is whether you build the plant now without this bill or with this bill. You're calling the 11% shareholders return profit, and it is to the shareholders. It's not to Georgia Power. It's to shareholders. Whoever owns the stock is getting that money. But excuse me. Yeah, the only money they're going to make is what the Georgia Public Service Commission says that they can make, and that's without or with this bill. The Georgia Public Service Commission decides how much they can have in stock and how much they can't have, and that is financial cost. You built the plant with $4.4 billion. It didn't all. You're saying, well, I assumed it was all debt. Well, you can't build the plant with all debt. The Public Service Commission won't let you build it with all debt. They're going to make you build it half with debt and half with increasing your stockholders' equity.
And what is the rate of return? What is the financial cost? It's whatever it costs to do these two things. Over here, it's just the interest, whatever they can get on interest. Over here, it's whatever the Public Service Commission says they can have as a rate of return on their shares. With this bill, Georgia Power is going to make less money, not more money.
Thank you, Chairman Balfour.
I take that as a yes, then. Is that true?
Well, I think the chairman would only inject here. I think that Chairman Balfour has answered the question. He provided the information, and members have to
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Representative Amos Amerson, Chairman of Science and Technology, has a question.
Chairman, just clarification on the contracts involving Georgia Power and the EMCs and the rest of those involved. The reactors themselves, that's a Georgia Power equity ownership, right? I mean, the EMCs won't own any part of that. Is that correct?
They do, don't they? They do, don't they? The EMCs, MEAGs, and I guess City of Dalton's involved in the 3 and 4 as well. They own 55% of the plant as well.
Are they providing 55% of the equity necessary to build these things? And all we're talking about here is the 45-cent side of it, because the PSC doesn't regulate the other 55%.
That's true.
Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
I hope everybody heard that. Thank you.
Listening and hearing are two different things, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Amerson. We have a question from Representative Jeff May.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, sir, for presenting this. Just a couple of brief questions.
Yes, sir.
Are there any other states that currently do this that you know? And this was probably gone over in the testimony from the hearings.
It was from the hearings, and I mentioned that as well. I'll give you the list that I have here of our southern states that do this. Florida, South Carolina, Louisiana, Virginia, Mississippi have all passed similar legislation to allow this to occur.
Okay. And
Florida, as I might add, it was brought up that Florida was doing away with theirs. It's not true. The bill was dropped Wednesday of last week, sometime last week, which makes their law more similar to actually what we're trying to do here.
Okay. And does the PSC have a particular position on this one way or the other?
I could not tell you that. I've not asked.
Okay. And finally, in looking at this, and I know you just saw it, as did I, what would be the effect of the Wicks amendment? I know everybody just got it, but
no, I have not had a chance to review it. I think it is I think it would probably lessen the opportunity for Georgia Power to get the financing costs that we're trying to get to, which will ultimately help the rate paying the customers. But I want to point out, you ask about the PSC, and that is not a slight to the PSC, but they are a body, as I pointed out, that was created by this General Assembly, and they do have oversight over anything that we do regarding energy in the state. And all we're doing here, this is, I believe, a legislative matter, because it creates some stability into this regulated company so that they can establish lower costs for their ratepayers in the long run. So it is not that I'm trying to ignore the PSC, but I think this is an issue that we should deal with. The PSC will still have full oversight over setting the rates and the profits of Georgia Power.
Thank you very much.
The chair recognizes Representative Hardy Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Harbin. Just one or two questions.
I like your name tag.
I appreciate that.
Right
hopefully I'll rise to that stature.
I'm only 5'6", but you should have passed that a long time ago.
To my good friend from Columbia County, we heard good testimony last week that we arrived at in Chairman Smith's meeting, that the ratepayers should anticipate a monthly increase of basically $1.30.
Yes, sir.
And that they should see that for an extended period of time. What I want to ask, and this is very similar to the question I asked last week, on page 2 of the bill, section 4, again dealing with the reset feature. If we anticipate the cost to go up, which is what the reset feature does, it deals with that whole component. Could I, as a consumer, expect that in year 2, if costs go up, that 130 correspondingly goes up as well.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. With that being said, and this is the question, this is where the rubber hits the road at the end of the day, how do we control costs escalations? We know that federal regulations have a tendency to change. Other things have a tendency to change, particularly after the original plans have been approved. What are we going to do, particularly from a ratepayer perspective, to try to control costs so that, if you tell me it's going to be $1.30 today, it's not $2.30 next year?
I think those costs will be controlled by the PSC. I mean, that is, they have the oversight of the construction and the work being done, and they will regulate the profits and the losses and all of those things, and they will be the ones that monitor and watch as the construction goes on in this plant.
And, again, I'm just a young legislator. What if I suggested that I'm not comfortable with that, but if by act of legislation we move forward with this, and I think it's a good bill, what can we do to make sure that we're doing what we can, not only to satisfy the need where Georgia Power is concerned, but also where the ratepayer is concerned?
Well, if we feel that the Public Service Commission is not doing their job to watch this and make sure there aren't excessive cost overruns and things like that, then this body has the authority to bring Georgia Power in or the PSC in, especially this committee, to question that. And that is something that has been done in the past by some of our committees, House and Senate, and it's something that will be done in the future. I think there will be enough eyes watching the construction of units 3 and 4, Mr. Davis, that I don't think there will be any way for them to slip out of line in making sure that this is done in the most or the least expensive manner that they can.
Mm-hmm. What further question, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
And again, I think this is prudent, at least on our parts, in terms of being, our public servants' best advocates. What can we do where this reset feature is concerned to give the ratepayer some assurance that these costs will be fairly fixed? I mean, I think we're in a situation now where construction costs across the board have gone down, which is a very good thing. But we don't anticipate that's going to remain forever. But what can we do? Because we know what the construction cycle is. These reactors, this technology is proven. We know how to do this with these packaged reactors. We know how to do this. And so from a purely technical perspective and just a ratepayer perspective, how do we get a win-win situation in light of having communicated to folks that your rate's only going to be $1.30. I've heard this in 2 different meetings, but now, based on my reading and understanding, that's not quite true.
Ms. Davis, I think it is true. I mean, based on the construction plans and everything that they have in place, and those people who are the experts who have planned out the construction of this plant, they have determined what those costs will be, and those costs will be in that range. And the Public Service Commission will have daily oversight to watch and ensure that that construction costs stay within the boundaries that we're trying to establish here. What the reset feature was really there for was to try to answer the questions of those that were concerned about excessive profit because of a lower cost of the financing, to allow them to reduce that and get it back in the ratepayers' hands when you reset it at the end of the year. I don't think that the rising construction costs, I really think that those will be monitored daily by the Public Service Commission. And as I said, we have oversight as well. And I think that there's enough oversight on that we will be assured that it is built well within its means or its actual cost by the time we open Plant Vogtle in 2016.
Thank you. Chair is going to recognize Coach Williams. And I want to say something here, and this is not reflected, or does not mean to, is not directed at any of the questions or anybody's asked questions. We still have a lot of questions, and I want to make sure that everybody who has a question has an opportunity to ask those questions, and I want to make sure that every question you have the opportunity to pose those questions. If you can just make them as think about them, make them as concise and to the point and to the bill as you can. And here again, it's not a reflection on anybody that's asked questions, but I want to make sure everybody gets to ask their questions, and you'll have the opportunity to have them answered. But if you can just keep them on point, concise, and to the bill. And with that, Coach Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for that tongue lashing. I will adhere to that. Chairman Harbin.
Yes, sir.
Representative Davis been looking at my notes. But anyway, let's look at the line on page 2, 58 and 59. Have the PSC certified these two new stacks? Have they been certified?
No, sir. The commission, I believe it's the 17th.
So they're not certified?
Yes.
Reading this, it said that they have.
No, sir. I think it's just speaking to the plants once they are certified. Once they are certified, I think so. We're just reading to the fact that once they are certified, that this is the financing.
The financing bill.
Mechanism that we in place.
So those two plants have not been certified yet.
We're waiting on I think the Public Service Commission as the last step. The federal government has approved the need for the energy. Georgia Power is qualified for these 2 reactors, I believe, and now we're waiting on the Public Service Commission.
Thank you. I will stop there.
Thank you, Representative Williams. Chair recognizes Representative Martin Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Harbin, thank you for presenting this bill. I'm going to apologize in advance for my simplicity on these kind of matters. I'm not an individual who deals in billions a whole lot. I'm like most of my constituents and probably most of yours. I deal in hundreds and fives and 20s and ones, and
quarters lately.
I really want to just bring this down to brass tacks here for all of our constituents, because that's really my concern. What you're telling me is that Georgia Power is building a nuclear plant, and it's going to cost my constituents, starting in 2016 and 17, on average, about a 12% increase on the average power bill of $100. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what you're telling me is that the proposed bill that we have in front of us, SB 31, will allow my consumers and my customers, my constituents, to save, the ones who are on Georgia Power, to save 3% per year, pretty much for the life of this power plant. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Well, that's a $36 per year savings, $3 per month savings on a $144 increase. And what you're telling me additionally is that if we pass this, it's going to allow the consumers and the constituents and the customers of Georgia Power who are in my district to invest over a 6-year period 1.3% annually, additionally, totaling about, from what I can tell, about $327, $328 over a 6-year period. And for that $327 investment, they're going to get an annual return of 36% savings. Does that sound, or $36 savings? Does that sound correct?
No, I don't. It sounds absolutely correct, and I know you've done these numbers. I was here in the subcommittee when you brought that up, and I think that everyone was very appreciative that you broke this down to a very simple manner so we could all understand it, and I appreciate you doing that here as well.
Well, that looks like an 11% annual return on investment, and that's a lot better than I think anybody can get on Wall Street and a lot of other places in real estate right now. And I think what you're doing
any
is
positive
correct.
return today is actually appreciated.
Absolutely. And so I think, it looks like a 600% return on what I invest, or what someone might invest right now for a child. Like, I have a 12-year-old. My 12-year-old, she's not paying power bills yet, but probably by the time this plant's built, she'll be paying power bills, or close to it, I hope. And once she starts paying her power bill, she's going to reap the reward for her entire life for a minimal investment that her mother and I are going to make for a short period of time. And now of course that applies only to those who are Georgia Power customers. But do you feel that this is a good consumer bill, and is this going to be something that's if we don't do it, that will be detrimental to customers? And do you feel like this is going to be something that's ultimately good for our constituents? Because that's really all I'm concerned about.
I would not be here, Mr. Scott, if I didn't believe that. I believe it's a good consumer bill because it saves the customers of Georgia Power, our constituents. It saves them money ultimately. It is a long-term savings over power needs that we have, energy needs that we have and will continue to have, because Georgia, even in these difficult times, is still growing. Even though a little more slightly than in the past, we are still growing. And so that energy need and that demand is still there. and nuclear is a good way to produce that power at a lower cost. And I think that Georgia Power has shown, with their example in the past, with the 15% below national average rates, that they can do this, and in the long term, the consumers, our constituents again, will benefit by having those energy needs met and have them met at a lower cost if we pass this bill today.
I have one final question.
Yes, sir.
This is it. And I think it has bearing on what's been stated already. There's concern that the cost could go up for this plant, and we can't control that. That's driven by the market. Would it be safe to say that if costs for constructing this nuclear plant go up over the next 10 years, will the savings also go up in tandem with that?
I'm not going to say that indefinitely. I think it should, absolutely, because you have a higher cost, and so you're picking up that savings by financing it early. But if those costs go up, a point that needs to be made is the cost of construction will still have to be paid, and it will be paid if this is not done in those 2 years when it's added to our rates, and it will go up significantly. So ultimately, yes, it will probably be a more significant savings if we do it this way.
Proportional savings.
A proportional savings if we do it this way. But I really do. I believe that this is a good bill for consumers. It is not being portrayed that way, but sometimes we have to think long term and think beyond every 2 years. And if you'll do that, you'll realize that in the long term, our energy needs of this state will be met, and they will be met at a lower cost, which benefits the ratepayers of Georgia Power.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Scott. Chair recognizes Representative Horn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make sure on something here. Representative Wicks has put an amendment on our desk. I think Representative May alluded to it a minute ago, but I just want to make sure I understand what the effect of this amendment will be. If I read this correctly, I think what he's trying to do here is he's trying to prohibit equity return on this project or any
Representative
nuclear
Horn. Thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt. I appreciate the question. You may ask your question. Ask it as it relates to the bill, as of what Representative asked. Don't ask it in relation to an amendment, because no amendment has been proposed at this time.
Okay. Well, then in that case,
you kind of rephrase that.
Can I defer then until the amendment is presented?
You can ask it right now, but you just need to ask it in a different manner. Ask as it relates to what Representative Wicks asked, what the answers were that the responses back, or how what you heard would affect the bill, but don't refer to an amendment, because there is no amendment at this time.
Okay, well then let me ask it this way: if the bill, let me ask it this way then: if shareholder equity, if return on equity investing by equity holders is prohibited, would that essentially mean that the project would have to be financed with 100% debt?
Mr. Warren, that's a good question, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for Mr. Wicks. I've just seen the amendment and have not had a chance to really review it and read it thoroughly. But as I do understand this, if we do not have the mix that's set up in there and the shareholders with the opportunities for returns, so many have talked about here the shareholders taking some risk. Well, if there's not an opportunity for return, they're not going to take any risk.
Exactly.
And if they don't take that risk and they don't put that investment into the company, then you're absolutely right. The cost of financing this project will go up significantly because of the cost of the debt.
Well, yeah, but I don't even know. Maybe this is a question for somebody else, but will the PSC even allow Georgia Power to finance a project this big with 100% debt?
I'm being told no.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Horn. Chair recognizes, let's see, hold just one second. Chair will recognize Representative Lucas at this time.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Let me ask one question. What is the scheduled date for construction?
To begin?
To begin.
The 2011 that's what's in the bill.
2011. If for some reason in 2011, if this bill passes and you start collecting, so $1.30 and goes up $1.30 every year. So the next following year is $2.60. The next one is $3.90. will the interest, and I would assume that that money would be put into an interest-bearing account, will the interest on the money that the ratepayers put in for finance charges, will they get a rate reduction based on the money that's accrued on the money that they put in on the interest?
That money that's being put in will have already been spent on those financing charges. That's why we're setting this up. And with the reset feature, if those financing charges were to go down the next year when the PSC reviews it, that rate could be adjusted down because that money is being spent to cover those costs of financing during the construction of the project.
The reason
there's no trust fund or account being set up to just hoard this money until it's completed. This is being done to reduce those interest costs today so that they don't accumulate and we have to pick them all up in 2016 and 17.
I would assume that the money has to go in the account. I mean, they got to have some accountability for that money being collected, that extra $1.30 in 2011. Now, my question is this. If the feds, which I understand right now talking about some kind of financing, they just hadn't made clear what kind as far as building nuclear power plants, because it is probably the most cheapest form of energy as well as efficient.
Yes.
Coal is the cheapest form, but we've got so many restrictions on it. But if they come up with something which reduces the cost of what people like Georgia Power be able to do as far as building a nuclear power plant, will there be a corresponding reduction in rate based on the money that's collected to pay the finance charge?
And Mr. Lucas, you've been around here as much longer than I have. You've been in this General Assembly, and you know that the federal government does not always act quickly.
That's true.
And so if they were to make those changes, whenever they might come, and they allowed that cost savings to come down so that Georgia Power could save some money in the construction of this, it will reduce our cost, because this is an actual cost of the construction of this plant, the financing charges for that. So if that construction cost goes down, the financing cost should go down, and we should see a benefit as ratepayers in that cost reduction. But I'm not sitting back waiting on the federal government to pass that anytime soon. I hope so, but I don't foresee that coming soon. But if it does, and they allow Georgia Power to participate in whatever those cost savings are, then I think that we will see costs in our rates, because this is based on the actual cost of construction.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Representative Bob Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to follow up with my fellow legislative sitting next to me, Representative Davis. I'm still concerned about prices going up. When I was a young adult, nuclear power plants, coal plants, natural gas plants, when they start, they have a set of plans stamped by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They have a set of plans stamped by whatever agency, authority, or regulatory agency that may be. And then at halftime, like in a basketball game, they change the rules. And you have to figure out how to play the game out. I'm real concerned that that how do we as a legislative body control these costs without outside interference from the federal government, from wherever it may come from? Because I just remember the very first nuclear power plant way back 30 years ago or so. It started out at, say, $1 billion, and it went up to $18 billion. No fault of Georgia Power, no fault of Oglethorpe Power, no fault of any of these types. How do we protect the consumer? And, Mr. Chairman, not only how do we protect the consumer in cost overruns, how do we protect Georgia Power and their stockholders? And if you want to get into this, it's an important question. How do we do this? And the second part of this, I understand that there could be a way to keep this in check, because there are prototypes that we will use in America going forward, similar to the French model, where you don't have these overruns. And from that standpoint, I'd like to hear from you. It may be out of your league here for the questions, but I'm deeply concerned for the ratepayers and for Georgia Power.
Well, Mr. Chairman Smith, I would not be here if I weren't concerned about the ratepayers. and I think this does ultimately save them money. And I think that is the focus of this bill. If the Nuclear Regulatory Commission comes in and decides that they want to change some of the rules at halftime, or even after the first dribble, which they do sometimes, then you have to go back and you have to adjust those costs in. But if they force up those costs, this bill will ultimately save the ratepayers even more because of the costs going up over what the cost would have been if we don't pass this bill. I can't control the Nuclear Regulatory Commission of the federal government, and I don't think anyone on this body can. We have to play within the guidelines and rules that they establish, and we will. And, as long as we continue to build the plants we're building today with the safeguards that they have today, which are safeguards that have been implemented over the last 30 years because of different instances, and those safeguards, I think, will protect the environment, but also protect the consumers from any accidents, and protect the consumers of getting an economically built plant, or as economically as you can build it, and keeping those safety measures in mind at the same time. So, can I tell you what the federal government will do tomorrow with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission as it stands? I cannot. But I can tell you that if those costs go up because of something the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has done to Georgia Power, then this bill is more important than ever because it ultimately saves money on those financing costs at a greater level, proportionate level for us, for us and our rate-paying friends throughout our districts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Smith. Chair recognizes, I think it's Representative May.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, one last question. And I'm a very simple person, so then I'm hoping that it will clear it up for me and maybe some other people. All right, normally we wouldn't start paying until 2017.
2016.
2016. Okay. And then we would have to pay interest on all of the debt and all of the costs that were incurred at that time.
Yes, sir.
So by doing this allows us to pay down principal early, which ultimately reduces. No? Yes.
It's just what this allows us to do is to cover the interest early so that the interest is not accumulating interest, and in 2016 when we have to pick up the tab on the whole thing, we're paying interest on top of interest. This allows us to pay down that interest early so that we are not sitting there with a much larger bill after the construction of these two reactors. Thank you.
Thank you. There's another question. Representative Holt, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, just for the sake of curiosity, would this compare, I realize couldn't compare 100%, but say you create the situation of, I built a house 10 years ago, had a construction loan. I chose to pay the interest on the construction loan as I went because I didn't want to have to roll those costs into my overall note at the end of the project. Is this a reasonable equivalent to that?
A very good example. It breaks it down very simply. All we're doing is trying to avoid paying interest on interest because that just drives up the cost of the energy to the customers in Georgia. So that is all we're asking you to do is allow them to pay that interest off early so we're not paying interest on top of the interest later. Thank you. Thank you.
Unfortunately, the gentleman that was going to speak just left, so at the moment we have no further questions.
Well, I can't sing, so it's going to be quiet.
Let me ask, if I may, let me ask you a question in regards to, we keep talking about the shareholders, but what we find is that in many cases those shareholders are the retirement funds of school teachers and they are not people that are out there in nowhere as if they're out in outer space. Could you give us a little bit of background that you know about those shareholders?
About the
shareholders?
Southern Company, Georgia Power shareholders? Yes, I mean, they're invested, they invest in the retirement funds. The retirement funds will invest in what they consider to be safe vehicles for return or safe corporations for return, and they have invested heavily probably throughout Southern Company because it has brought them a really good return or and a few years ago, just an average return. But today is viewed as a much better because it's a more stable return, which is good for us because that return keeps the investors continuing to invest, which allows us to have a partner, the ratepayers and all of us who are trying to pass this bill today, to have a partner as we're building this plant because they're freely investing into this company and they expect a good return. And that return would not have happened if Georgia Power, who's regulated again, and their profits will be regulated. But if they weren't doing their job right, those investments wouldn't occur and that return wouldn't be there. So the shareholders' investments benefit not just that individual, but they benefit those retirement plans, which do affect our teachers and our state employees and anyone else who's invested in a large pension plan.
Thank you, Chairman Harbin. I want to recognize Representative Martin for what I believe and hope to be the last question.
Chairman Harbin, you've been gracious with your time. I know you're responsible for that little thing we call the budget. Going back to the question that the Representative Wicks had, is it not true that the cost of capital to build a plant, whether it be Unit 2, 3, and 4 of Vogel or another plant that the power company wants, the cost of capital that is approved by the PSC is part of a rate case they can bring forward at the time to recover the cost of that plant. Is that not true?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I just want to make sure that I'm clear on it because there are two kinds, as Senator Balfour said. There's the cost of capital and there's the cost of debt. Both of those items today, when approved by the PSC, are recoverable after the fact. Is that not true?
Yes, sir.
So what we're trying to do, whether it be cost of capital or cost of debt, is just pay that as we go so that we are not paying interest on the cost of capital that would otherwise be available to the company. Isn't that true?
That's all we're doing, yes, sir.
All I needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative Martin. We do have another question. Representative Williams, Coach Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Harbin.
Yes, sir.
There's no one here from the governor's office, is it?
I have no clue.
Oh, okay. I just wonder how he felt about that.
Thank you, Coach Williams.
I'm sure we'll learn something.
Thank you. I see no more questions. Representative Harbin, Chairman of the Appropriations Committee, presenting the bill. If you would like to have some words to wrap this up, if you would like to even have a moment or two, if you needed to collect your any information or thoughts, I'm going to leave it up to you. But if you would like to proceed in any manner you'd like to go ahead and wrap this up.
I would like to wrap this up. I think we've discussed it. It's been discussed thoroughly through the Senate and through the House subcommittee and then through this committee. And I want to thank all of you for your time today and your questions. And this is an important measure. It is a simple measure. I don't want that to be confused or whether intentional or unintentional, because this is a simple measure. But it's important in the fact that we have energy demands in Georgia. And those energy demands, we will have to meet those energy demands. So we will need both of these reactors. We know that. That's not debatable. But what is debatable is, do we want the ratepayers of Georgia to pay more to construct those plants, or do we want to come up with a way that will save them money, which ultimately saves all of us money? And I think that we're doing that here so that we're not paying interest on top of interest. And that is very simply all we're doing. The Senate added a few amendments to ensure that if there is profit or if those financing costs go down, that the ratepayers will benefit even more. And that is a good measure. They put in there for the 200% of poverty to protect those people who are on fixed and struggling incomes. They took something that was in regulation, which was 150%, increased it to 200, and put that now in statute if you pass this legislation. So this is a good consumer piece of legislation, because ultimately it will allow us to meet those energy demands that we have to meet. That is not, again, debatable. But it will allow us to do it in a lower cost by saving the ratepayers of Georgia Power $300 million ultimately. And that is all we're asking you to do. I will close with that, Mr. Chairman, and thank you and the committee again for your time today.
Thank you, Representative Harbin, for your very detailed presentation of the bill and answering these questions. We appreciate that. At this time, the chair would ask, what's the pleasure of the committee? Chairman recognizes Representative Hardy Davis.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. At the appropriate time, I'd like to be recognized and make a motion.
This would be the appropriate time.
after hearing the testimony from last week and again on today, and certainly doing the research, I'd like to recommend a do pass motion.
Okay, we have a motion to approve for this committee to approve Senate Bill 31 with a do pass recommendation to the full House. Is there a second? Did I hear a second? Second by Representative Amerson. Is there any discussion? Chair recognizes Representative Wicks.
I have an amendment I'd like to propose, if I could, please.
Representative Wicks, you're recognized to. You're not necessarily recognized. You're not recognized to make a motion at this time, but you are recognized to tell us what you would like to do.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've laid the proposed amendment on your desk, and I thank Representative Holt for his example, and that's exactly what this amendment would do. You know, if you're building a house, you pay your interest as you go, so you don't have to pay it when you finish it. This amendment would, you can read at the top. With this amendment, all the interest and loans and debt would be prepaid. What would not be prepaid is utility profit and the taxes on that profit.
Representative Wicks, let me interrupt just for a second. Does everybody have a copy of what Representative Wicks is talking about? Some language he put on our desk? Okay.
Okay. That would begin, that amendment would start on line 19, page 1, and go through line 63 on page 2, and then thanks to the our very efficient legislative council, I've got, if you'd look on the first page, line 4, after financing, insert the word debt on line 5. Just before financing, over near the end of the sentence, insert debt, the debt financing. On line 8, replace the word costs with debt. And on line 9, also replace the word costs with debt. And I'd like to make that in the form of a motion. I think that's right. I make a motion to amend Senate Bill 31.
Representative Wicks, I've looked at this. I've looked at the information that you've put on our desk and what you would like to propose as an amendment. And I'm going to go ahead and allow you to propose that amendment. So if you'd like to make a motion, now would be the time.
I'd like to make a motion to amend Senate Bill 31, as I just said.
All right. No, I'm not asking for a second. I want to ask Representative Harbin, who presented the bill, if he objects to this.
Yes, sir, I would object to that. We have this bill has been worked on and changed a good bit. As I said, it's the first time I've seen it. I understand the good intentions of the author of the amendment, but I think that the current version of this bill does exactly what he's trying to get to without by ensuring that we're just paying interest with this $1.30, which is what we discussed here today. And I would ask that the committee to reject this amendment at this time.
Okay, thank you. We have a motion, and it has been objected to, but before we can proceed, there would have to be a second. Is there a second to this, the motion that Representative Wicks has made? Second. Did I hear a second? Well, let's see if there's a second. I think I heard Representative Coach Williams second it. Is there discussion on the amendment? Okay, help me find out who's who here. Okay, Chair recognizes Representative Cox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While I, too, appreciate what Representative Wicks is trying to accomplish, I also have a great deal of confidence in the PSC. And line 26 of the bill speaks to the concerns that I share with Representative Wicks. It talks about how the financing costs will be based on the actual cost of debt, and then also the authorized cost of equity and capital there on 26 and 27, isn't it true, will be determined by the commission. So even if the bill passes, my assumption, Mr. Chairman, is that the commission retains a great deal of authority over what the actual costs that would fall under the purview of Senate Bill 31 are. And so with that, I'm going to vote against the amendment and just wanted to offer that thought to the committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Cox. Further discussion, we have the chair recognizes Representative Bob Smith. Oh. Chair recognizes Representative Holt.
To go back to my construction loan example, I have to differ with Representative Wicks because even though you're talking about cost of capital versus cost of debt, if we ignore the cost of capital by accepting this amendment, that cost of capital still piles up during each year of construction, and thus we're adding up interest on interest to be paid later. So in other words, by accepting this amendment, we're diminishing the value of this whole structure to try to pay the interest or cost of capital as it's incurred rather than letting it pile up. So for that reason, I would oppose this amendment, sir.
Thank you, Representative Holt. Chair recognizes Representative Williams, Coach Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, parliamentary inquiry, please. I had a question about the vote. When we get ready to take the vote, I'd like to acknowledge my vote as to why I'm voting to abstain. When can I do that?
Well, you can. Thank you for the question. I don't know how parliamentary I can answer your parliamentary inquiry, but when a vote comes up on this amendment or on a bill or any other amendment, you will have three ways you can vote as I'm thinking about it. You can vote yay, nay, or you have the right to abstain. But that's it. There are no narratives that go with that, no explanations that will go with it. That will be your vote.
Okay. At the appropriate time, I'm voting to abstain until the commissioner make that decision.
Okay, that will be your right at that time. Chair recognizes Representative Lucas.
Mr. Chairman, you stated earlier, I heard Representative Cox, and he talked about line 26. But, a lot of us were not on the subcommittee that heard the bill, and you did not allow the Public Service Commission to even answer the 26. I mean, that might have cleared it all up, but, I mean, you said they were not going to answer unless the chairman of the who's presenting the bill asked them to answer. And I just want to know at this time, can we ask them, based on what Representative Wicks is trying to do in his amendment, will they do exactly that?
Representative Lucas, thank you for the question. I have the greatest respect for you as a member of the committee. And
I have respect for you, Mr. Chairman.
Former chairman. I think I had directed the presenter of the bill, if he, in trying to answer his question or trying to provide greater information, if he wanted to clarify that by having someone from the audience, someone from the public provide information, that he could, and that, unless I was mistaken, I didn't see that. We've had a series of hearings on this in the subcommittee. There were two. I think each one of those meetings lasted over 2 hours at least. And with all due respect, too, everybody's known this bill was coming for some time. So I think there's been ample time to gather the information. And this meeting is just not intended to be a meeting for
I just wanted to get a question answered, Mr. Chairman. I was in another committee meeting dealing with another bill. Okay. So.
But thank you, Representative Lucas. I appreciate it. Is that your question or your comment?
That was my question, whether or not you could ask them, based on what Representative Cox said on line 26, whether or not the PSC would do exactly what Representative Wicks is trying to do with his amendment.
Well, thank you. Any further debate on this amendment? Yes, sir. Hold on. Representative Mangum. You recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize. I had another meeting also, unfortunately, and I was the only voice that had to disappoint a lot of my friends to vote against this bill in subcommittee. I did not know whether or not it came up, but there was a article in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution that I just want to ask whether or not it came up at all, that talked about, it actually showed that there was a significant fiscal impact on the state from SB 31, and whether or not the chairman did require, whether or not, if I so moved, to require a fiscal note in order that this that we would be fully appraised at this, because as I understand it, there was, according to an article that was in the on February the 4th of 2009, estimated that it was $11.70 per 1,000 kilowatt hours that will be added in regarding the estimated impact of Plant Vogtle cost recovery. Was that discussed in my absence, or where are we on that, if at all?
Representative Megan, I'm not sure what, I'm really not clear as what your question is. There would be no, I think you mentioned a fiscal note. There would be no fiscal note related to this bill because there's no cost to there's no funds that would come from the state treasury in any way to provide for this bill. And as to what was discussed in the subcommittees, I mean, I was at most of them, but I can't tell you everything that was discussed. But that's the best I can tell you. There'd be no fiscal note attached to this. There would be no reason for there to be one, and I don't know that particular point you're trying to make or question goes to this amendment. Thank you. You have another question?
If I provided I don't know if I could provide the committee with what supposedly is an estimated impact starting in 2009 to 2028, based on what is evidently SB 31. I understand what you're saying, but I'm simply going by an article that was in the Atlanta Journal and they may, sometimes the paper is way off base. Sometimes. But if we are going to make some people pay some money, at least we can at least ask the question.
Representative Mang, I appreciate it. I have not seen the article. I don't know what the article says. But anything that, any questions that would have been raised out of that, or any of the questions that they raised from early questions that have been asked or whatever, that needed to be brought up during the subcommittee process. But thank you. I appreciate the concern. We're going to stop this discussion on this debate or on this amendment real soon, but the chair will recognize 15. Representative Drenner.
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to move the previous question.
Representative Drenner, thank you. I appreciate that. If I'm understood, I think Representative Wicks may have one more thing to add. And at that point, if it doesn't end at that time, I'm going to recognize you. Thank you. Representative Wicks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My light doesn't light up, so I'm not sure if I'm on or not. I just want to make one last point. It is my understanding that 2/3 of the $1.6 billion that will be collected is due to equity, and 1/3, about $500 billion. Of that equity, there's $400 million in taxes that have to be paid, which means that about 75% of this total money collected relates to the equity portion of this debt. And there is about 50-50 debt to equity ratio in this project. And we're talking about saving the state of Georgia $300 million, but yet we're dealing with a lot of money to save $300 million. So that's why have introduced this amendment, and I appreciate your favorable consideration.
Thank you, Representative Wicks. We have a motion for an amendment, the Wicks amendment. We have a second. The amendment was objected to by the presenter of the bill. And at this time, all in favor. Let me ask you first, is there any further discussion? Seeing no further discussion, all in favor of the Wicks Amendment, say aye. Aye. All opposed, no.
No.
The chair believes that the noes clearly have it, but in order to be perfectly clear, I'm going to ask again, all those in favor of the Wicks Amendment, please raise your hand. One hand. You count those. Okay, all put your hands down. All opposed, please raise your hand. The Wicks Amendment fails. Thank you. Is there any further discussion on Senate Bill 31? Okay. Representative Drenner.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know when's appropriate time. I'd like to put video notice I filed minority report.
Oh, that's your right. That's your right. Thank you. We have a do pass motion on the bill. We have a second. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of approving Senate Bill 31 with a do pass recommendation to the full House, please signify so by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed, say no. No. The ayes clearly have it. This Senate Bill 31 is approved by this committee, moves on to the full House, and a report will be given to the House Rules Committee. Thank you.
I was not clear on the minority report moving on, but if he was moving on the minority report on this amendment, I would also like the minority report on that bill itself.
There is no motion required for minority report. Representative Wicks indicated he would file one. He has that right, and you can sign on to it if you like. With that, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.